Good morning. The aim of my paper is to consider the promise and possibility of a Christocentric theology regulated by the Nicene tradition. Against the backdrop of a modern Christocentric movement, vexed at every turn by the threat of indeterminacy, a threat I will expand upon in my first section, the desirability of a Christocentrism stabilized by creedal norms is perhaps obvious, especially here in this auspicious assembly. But the undertaking nevertheless has its critics, for a significant number of biblical scholars and theologians of the majority world have expressed concern that heightened emphasis upon conciliar categories will artificially homogenize the discourse of theology, which in a way that has the effect of stifling the multivalent voice of Holy Scripture and also suppressing the diverse voice and witness of the Church and her members across time, space, language, and circumstance. The apprehensions reflected in this concern are undoubtedly important ones, but a closer examination of the 4th century controversies introduces a tinge of irony, I suggest. For it is not actually the defenders of Nicaea, but instead their theological opponents who advance an austere conception of religious language which forcefully stifles diversity of theological expression. Somewhat paradoxically, it is only by negating these austere alternatives, and thus apparently by narrowing the Church's dogmatic field of vision, that the Nicene settlement bequeaths to its adherents precisely the kind of capacious horizon of discourse which biblical scholars and others are so rightly jealous to defend. In short, far from inspiring opposition to a renewed embrace of the Nicene tradition, the concern to maintain space for a plurality of theological grammars within the Church should be regarded as a compelling reason to support the prospect of a Christocentric theology regulated and stabilized by the Nicene tradition. My paper unfolds in 2 sections. The first locates the appeal of a Nicene Christocentrism in relation to the putative failures of a modern Christocentric movement, and then briefly reiterates why some are convinced that a regulative turn to Nicaea must be resisted in order to reserve space within theological inquiry for a plurality of discourse registers. The second section turns to the Eunomian controversy in particular, with these specific concerns in mind, arguing in the end that a close examination of this debate reveals that far from stifling diversity of theological expression, the Nicene tradition, at least as Basil and Gregory of Nyssa represent and conceive of it, positively establishes the vital necessity of multivalent theological discourse by grounding it upon a coherent dogmatic rationale. So first, section 1, the desirability and the apparent objectionability of a Nicene Christocentrism. The modern programmatic turn to Christ-centeredness was initially catalyzed to a great extent by a desperate quest for stability in response to the erosive pressures of modern critique. The centrifugal forces of higher criticism, the closed epistemological ceiling of critical reason, the acids of radical historicism, all these collude in the modern West to produce a situation of apparent rootlessness for the discipline of Christian theology. The tottering of antiquity's venerable pillars, scripture, tradition, and reason, provoked a search for yet deeper bedrock and inspired countless creative attempts to redefine the essence of Christianity in terms demonstrably compliant with the new strictures of modern thought. One can readily sympathize, I think, with the impulse to Christocentrism, which overtakes the enterprise of dogmatic theology in relation to these formidable challenges. Turning to Christ would seem to be an eminently sensible strategy in the search for stability. For what is more essential and more fundamental to Christianity than Jesus Christ himself? And yet, for all its understandable appeal, the modern Christocentric turn appears, in my estimation, to have backfired. As Ernst Troeltsch points out in a remarkably incisive essay published in 1911, there is a strong case to be made that theology's exaggerated turn to Christology throughout the modern period ultimately served only to exacerbate the destabilizing pressures of modern critique in the long run. For who is Jesus Christ apart from the canonical, conceptual, creedal, and historical frames of reference which traditionally have mediated knowledge of him? Or as Troeltsch himself puts it, what happens to Christology, quote, when the ground for any connection between religion and historical facts is completely taken away? Close quote. It does not require an expansive imagination to recognize the risk of Christological disintegration which exists under such conditions. As the Lutheran theologian Robert Jensen has notably emphasized, the ability to pick out or to recognize a person generally depends upon reliable access to some aspect of that individual's incommunicable history. This principle of hypostatic recognition, as we might call it, would seem to confront the modern Christocentric strategy with a significant dilemma, suggesting that to the extent that it accepts the alienation of Christological discourse from canon, creed, reason, and history, all sources of theological knowledge ostensibly vulnerable to the acids of modern critique, the strategy can succeed only at the steep cost of rendering Jesus Christ finally anonymous and thus unrecognizable to the church across time and space. For a complex set of reasons which need not concern us here, Troeltsch himself is not particularly distressed by the prospect of a lapse into indeterminacy for Christian theology. However, readers less sanguine about this possible future than he are likely to emerge from his essay motivated to reflect afresh upon the nature of a properly Christ-centered theology, and prompted to reconsider also, with the help of intervening scholarly developments, whether the comprehensive abdication by some strands of modern theology of classical sources once lending stability to Christological recognition was really necessary and worth the many trade-offs. Now, it is precisely here, in relation to this counter-movement downstream of Troeltsch, that the desirability of a Nicene Christocentrism comes into focus. For heightened recourse to the Nicene tradition carries with it the promise of a restabilized Christocentric discourse which mediates Christological recognition by locating Jesus in relation to a fixed theological horizon, thus ostensibly making it possible for theologians and members of the church to pick him out or recognize him once again in a consistent and unified manner. The prospect of a Nicene Christocentrism inevitably provokes a wide range of questions and concerns. For purposes of this paper, we will restrict our gaze to that specific concern which my introduction has already sketched. In various ways, John Goldingay, Kwame Bediako, and John Flett, among many others, have expressed an acute concern that stabilization of Christological recognition, secured through heightened recourse to creedal norms, will inevitably come at the cost of stifling the pluriform witness of Scripture and of suppressing the widely diverse voices of Christians scattered across time, space, and circumstance. The operative fear expressed in this concern is that turning to Nicaea will carry with it a homogenizing principle which irons out creative difference, thus draining theological discourse of its richness and of its vitality. In short, if the defining threat of modern Christocentrism is a lapse into indeterminacy which undermines Christological recognition, then the defining threat of a Nicene Christocentrism, at least from the vantage point of these critics, is that it foists an excessively determinate conceptual grammar onto the discourse of theology, thus effectively displacing or bowdlerizing the multi-textured witness of Scripture and history. In part 2, we turn briefly to the anti-Eunomian writings of Basil and Gregory of Nyssa as an access point from which to consider whether concerns of this sort about a revitalized regulative deployment of the Nicene tradition are warranted. So, section 2, the Cappadocians and the discursive fecundity of Nicene Christocentrism. It may not initially be obvious why the Eunomian controversy should be regarded as a suitable point of reference from which to explore the question of multivalent theological discourse in relation to the Nicene tradition. Like so many of the other debates of the 4th century, however, there is far more to the Eunomian controversy than may initially meet the eye. On a surface level, the debate would seem to consist primarily in the question of how rightly to construe the ontological entailments of the Son's begottenness vis-a-vis the unbegottenness of the Father. As one presses beyond superficial acquaintance with the relevant texts, however, it quickly becomes obvious that a rejection of the Son's ontological union with the Father is, for the Cappadocians at least, really just the presenting symptom of a much broader pathology at work within Eunomius' thought, a complex and interconnected network of misguided intuitions concerning the epistemological and linguistic implications of divine transcendence and divine simplicity, the capacity of human reason, the nature of religious language, and the purposes of Holy Scripture. In short, as Mark Del Cogliano has surmised, the debate ultimately has to do with clarifying, quote, the very theology of theology itself. The status of multivalence in religious discourse becomes visible in relation to this broader horizon as a significant leitmotif and unifying thread of the major anti-Eunomian writings authored by Basil and Gregory. The salient question lurking underneath the surface is whether multivalence of religious discourse is an obstacle to be overcome in the pursuit of true knowledge of God, or whether, to the contrary, it is salutary and indeed necessary in relation to that broader undertaking. Accessing the controversy from this vantage point unearths what might usefully be described as a fundamental clash of logics. There is, on the one hand, a logic of discursive austerity, espoused by Eunomius, on the one hand, and on the other, a logic of discursive fecundity, espoused by Basil and by Gregory. And the important point to notice here, at least for present purposes, before turning to expound these two logics with a bit more specificity, is the fact that it is unequivocally the pro-Nicene voices who stand on the side of defending the desirability and the necessity of multivalent theological discourse. This feature of the debate is notable, I suggest, because it provides impetus for modern theologians to consider the possibility that conventional concerns about the stifling effects of a Nicene theological grammar may ultimately be misplaced. So first, a brief sketch of Eunomius and what I'm calling his logic of discursive austerity. The logic of discursive austerity advanced by Eunomius effectively treats multivalence of religious discourse as a problem to be overcome. For Eunomius, at least as Basil and Gregory interpret him, all divine names belong to one of two possible categories. First, names which are reducible in meaning to the same identical signification. This is what Andrew Roddy Galwitz refers to as the principle of synonymity. And second, names which do not share this unifying signification and which must therefore be dismissed as altogether equivocal. It is precisely this reductive analysis of religious language which Gregory has in mind when he chides Eunomius in Book 2 of his Contra Eunomium for the manifest absurdity of his attempt to, quote, squeeze the being of God into a single term, close quote. The impulse to austerity in Eunomius arises to a great extent from his emphasis upon the transcendence and simplicity of God. Names signify essences, according to Eunomius, and it follows from this premise that every term of mundane and composite origin is completely opaque to the ineffable reality of God. Only the provision of something like a divine word can make it possible for human beings to signify God's transcendent perfection. And since God is simple, this essence-signifying term would likewise need to be utterly singular as well, lest it be implied through a multiplicity of words that God also is composite. In short, doing justice to the inexpressible perfection of God for Eunomius means contracting all religious speech to a single, solitary term. As we know, the privileged word Eunomius settles upon as that which alone properly signifies the divine essence is the alpha privative term agenitas, unbegotten. And much of the anti-Eunomian corpus, authored by the Cappadocian Fathers and by others, is devoted to refuting the most conspicuous entailments of this designation, which is, of course, to deny that the only begotten Son of God is coessential with the Father. Underneath and alongside this decisive entailment, however, is the broader question of how Eunomius thinks about the whole enterprise of knowing God and speaking of God. And with respect to these broader concerns, the clear implication of his account is to disparage sources of multiplicity in theological discourse, such as the multivalent witness of Scripture, as at best infelicitous nuisances from which the theologian must learn to abstract. Ironically, what remains on the other side of Eunomius's reductive abstractions, as Basil astutely observes in Book 1 of his treatise, is not actually knowledge of God in any positive sense, but merely a negation or liminal concept which alerts us to the fact that we still do not really know God at all. In short, for Eunomius's logic of discursive austerity, the perfection of God is not apprehended through a conscientious gathering up of religious language towards an inexhaustible plenitude, which is God, but rather through a systematic demolition or retreat of language into an inaccessible abyss. Now to the Cappadocian logic of discursive fecundity. The alternative logic of discursive fecundity espoused by Basil and Gregory is likewise grounded in a robust affirmation of divine simplicity and divine transcendence, though here the trajectory of inference, which is catalyzed by these affirmations, is strikingly different from what we find in Eunomius, leading for them not to austerity of expression, but rather to a copious profusion of theological speech. For as Basil and Gregory never tire of emphasizing, no solitary word, nor even any great sum of words, could ever hope to exhaust the greatness of divine perfection. An important section from Book 2 of Gregory's Contra Eunomium is representative here, and I quote, "Since no one title has been discovered to embrace the divine nature by applying directly to the subject itself, we therefore use many titles to name the divinity, as we hunt amid the pluriform variety of terms applying to him for sparks to light up our understanding of the object of our quest." Close quote. Basil and Gregory alike regard it as quite ridiculous for Eunomius to suppose that any term, word, name, or concept apprehensible to the mind of finite human creatures could somehow signify, much less encapsulate, the divine essence, even according to the mode of negation. Names do not signify essences, even with reference to creaturely realities, the Cappadocian Fathers protest. And when it comes to divine names, these must be understood as but humble, creaturely modes of response, not to the divine essence per se, but rather to divine activities. And even here, the gestures of thought and language wielded by human knowers are always inevitably partial, imperfect, fragmentary, and indirect. It is precisely on account of this partiality of human language and thought, Basil insists, that recourse to a multiplicity of names for God is quite necessary. And again, I quote, this time from Basil. "Such is the situation. There is not one name which encompasses the entire nature of God and suffices to express it adequately. Rather, there are many diverse names, and each one contributes in accordance with its own meaning to a notion that is altogether dim and trifling as regards the whole, but which is at least sufficient for us." Close quote. Neither Basil nor Gregory construe the multiplicity of religious speech, nor the mundane origination of theological terms per se, as a defect or as a problem to be overcome. The decisive problem arises instead from the proclivity of human knowers to distort the proper signification of theological terms by attaching inappropriate and misguided inferences and associations to those terms. It is principally this proclivity to misuse, and not fundamentally the speech itself, which generates the need for an ascesis or a purification of religious language. Unlike Eunomius, the ascesis Basil and Gregory have in mind does not require an effacement of multiplicity, but consists instead in a conscientious willingness to allow the vast and internally diverse witness of Holy Scripture to guide, chasten, and correct the web of inferences and associations attached by human knowers to this or that theological term. Error arises precisely when terms are isolated from this multivalent pedagogy and vested with inferences and significations unconstrained by its salutary chastening influence. When Basil and Gregory read Eunomius, what they ultimately detect is the catastrophic outworking of precisely this kind of error, namely a dislocation of the term unbegotten from the chastening influence of the sacred divine pedagogy, and most especially from the term Father, which is part of that pedagogy. Indeed, there is a profound sense in which the whole logic of discursive austerity, which unfolds in Eunomius, may be understood as set in motion by this primordial dislocation. For it ensconces at the heart of Eunomius's theological outlook a conception of God not as the inexhaustible, communicative fullness of divine majesty, but rather instead as the inexpressible absence of imperfection, or as Gregory so incisively puts it, a glory which emits no light. The dislocation is thus problematic not simply because it impugns the deity of the Son and grossly distorts the shape of redemption, but also because it gives rise to an austerity logic which occludes the positive and indeed necessary function of discursive multivalence within the divine economy. For present purposes, what is most important to notice from all this is the fact that Basil and Gregory oppose Eunomius's logic of discursive austerity not in spite of their embrace of Nicaea, but rather precisely as an outgrowth of Nicaea's affirmation of the Son as coessential with the Father, and therefore as nothing less than the very radiance of God's glory. Against the backdrop of the alternative logic of discursive fecundity, which Basil and Gregory so eloquently advance on the basis of this most characteristically Nicene affirmation, there is good reason, I think, to doubt that heightened emphasis upon conciliar categories will necessarily result in an unnatural homogenization of theological discourse, which so many modern theologians instinctively fear. In sum, peering over the shoulders of these two important thinkers gives us reason to hope that a Nicene Christocentrism is sturdy enough to avoid the besetting defects of the modern Christocentric turn, and also capacious enough to mollify the concerns of its critics. Thank you very much.